After 17 years, they didn't even let me finish my coffee. My name is Julian Reyes. I'm 54 years old. And until last month, I was the head of internal audit systems at a Fortune 500 firm on the East Coast. 17 years, 3 CEOs, dozens of reorganizations, hundreds of audits. I stayed through it all. Quiet, efficient, precise. The kind of employee no one noticed until they needed something fixed. And when they no longer needed me, they didn't say thank you. They didn't even let me finish my coffee. It happened on a Monday, the kind of gray, overcast morning where even the skyline looked exhausted. I'd barely sat down still reviewing the flagged expense report from Friday when the ping hit my inbox. Please come to HR, effective immediately. No subject, no explanation, just 5 words and a calendar invite. I knew. You don't work in audit for almost 2 decades without learning how to read between the lines. Especially when they stop CCing you altogether. HR was waiting. So was a security guard I'd never seen before. The room smelled like antiseptic and canned indifference. They used phrases like strategic transition and role redundancy. I didn't speak. I didn't ask. I didn't argue. It wouldn't have changed anything. When they handed me the manila envelope, I noticed they spelled my name wrong on the cover letter. 17 years. And they couldn't even spell it right. I signed the exit documents, slid my badge across the table, and watched the lights on my company-issued phone blink off one by one. They told me I could collect my belongings under supervision. 15 minutes. I walked through the halls I helped keep clean, not with a mop, but with integrity. Every system flag, every discrepancy I caught, every quiet decision to protect the company when no one else noticed. It didn't matter now. People avoided my eyes. Some looked down. A few whispered. No one said a word. At my desk, I saw the old mug I kept from my first audit project. It still had a faded sticker on it that read, "Check twice. Trust once." I left it on the shelf. I only took my jacket, a thumb drive I legally owned, and a small notebook. Then I turned, paused, and looked up at the corner camera. They thought it was just security footage. But I knew how the system worked, because I built the audit interface that stored the metadata. I knew which cameras stored sound and which ones didn't. That one did. On the elevator ride down, I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. What I felt was empty. Like someone had cut out the part of me that used to believe in loyalty. But even in that silence, something stirred. A thought. Not revenge. Not yet. Just curiosity. What made them feel so safe, so untouchable that they thought they could erase me without consequence? They thought I was just another cog, a relic, disposable. What they didn't know, what they never cared to learn, was that I didn't just run their audit system. I designed it, and 17 years ago during the build phase, I embedded something most people missed. A clause. A clause buried deep inside the logic. Invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. Built not to punish, but to protect. Not the company, not me. The truth. If you've ever given years of your life to a place only to be pushed aside like you never mattered, if you've ever sat in that silent HR room feeling like a ghost at your own funeral, then this story is for you. Stick around. Because what happened after I walked out of that building wasn't a meltdown, wasn't a breakdown. It was the quiet start of something I'd written into their future long before they ever decided mine. If you've ever been underestimated by people in power, hit subscribe. This isn't just my story, it's yours too. They forgot I wrote the protocol. I still remember the first time I touched the source code. It was 2006. Back when the company still ran on paper invoices and overworked assistants with color-coded binders. The compliance department was a joke back then, 3 people and a shared printer. I wasn't hired as an architect. At the time I was a junior analyst, barely a year out of school. But I noticed things, little things, like how expense approvals always came in batches but the timestamps were out of sync. Or how certain vendor names appeared across multiple departments with different addresses but identical tax IDs. No one saw the patterns, no one wanted to. So I built something on my own time. It started as a side project. Just a few scripts that scraped ledger entries and cross-referenced vendor approvals. At first it flagged noise, duplicates, typos, human error. But then, one week, it found something real. A series of approvals signed off during a holiday weekend by a manager who was out of the country. I brought it to my supervisor. He shrugged, told me not to worry about it. That was the first lesson. In big companies, it's not fraud until someone important gets embarrassed. So I kept the script, refined it, fed it more data. I didn't build it to punish anyone. I built it because someone had to keep the ledger honest. Over the years, as the company grew, so did the system. And eventually, someone higher up noticed that my little tool caught an error that saved the company nearly $500,000 in overpaid vendor invoices. Suddenly, it wasn't just a side project. They gave me a team, a title, and for a while they gave me trust. By 2013, I was leading the internal audit systems overhaul. We were preparing for a major acquisition, and the board wanted everything tightened. I designed the backbone of what they called TraceLock, a real-time monitoring system that cross-checked financial events across multiple departments and ran silent anomaly detection in the background. It wasn't flashy, but it worked, and it didn't lie. That's when I wrote the clause. Not in legal terms, not in policy. I wrote it into the system itself, a line of logic buried 3 layers deep inside the trace inheritance rules. It simply said, if the internal audit account is deactivated and no override is issued within 90 days, initiate external trace broadcast to designated compliance endpoints. That's it. No alarms, no flashy warnings, just a quiet countdown and a contingency trigger. I didn't build it out of paranoia. I built it because I'd seen what happened when companies investigated themselves. They stop at the threshold of self-destruction. They pull back when the truth gets too expensive. So I created something that would keep going, even if I couldn't. And to make sure it stayed safe, I documented it under a compliance maintenance routine in the appendix of a technical memo no one ever reads. Appendix D Revision 11, Clause 17b. I never thought they'd activate it. For years, the system just ran silently, occasionally flagging minor issues, timing errors, duplicate reimbursements, petty abuse. It kept the house clean, and people started trusting it too much. They stopped asking how it worked, stopped wondering where the alerts came from. It became furniture, useful, dependable, invisible. Then came the new leadership. They didn't grow up with the system, didn't see how it evolved. They saw it as a liability, too rigid, too conservative, too slow. So they started pushing back. First with budget cuts, then with reorgs, and finally with people. I watched 2 of my best engineers get moved laterally out of audit. Another was pushed into retirement, and I was left behind until I wasn't. But even then, I didn't feel rage, because I knew something they didn't. They thought firing me would silence the system, cut the power at the source. What they forgot was that I never needed the system to shout. I just needed it to remember, and it did. The first leak didn't come from the system. It came from the hallway. There's something strange about being invisible in a place you helped build. People stop guarding their words when they think you're gone. But sometimes when you're still close enough to listen, they forget you were ever there to begin with. That's exactly what happened the day I returned to pack my things. They gave me a 15-minute window, accompanied by a junior HR rep I didn't recognize, and a security guard who kept checking his phone. I took my time, not out of defiance, just to slow down the moment. After 17 years, you don't just grab a box and leave. You notice things. What's missing? What's changed? My office had been cleaned already. Too clean. The frame certifications were gone. The notepad I always kept next to my monitor replaced. Even the pens were rearranged. But one thing was still there. A small black USB drive I used for personal backups. Not company files, just old template scripts I'd written years ago and a few diagrams from the early audit models. They must have missed it, or didn't know what it was. I slipped it into my coat pocket. Didn't say a word. I was on my way out when I heard them. 2 voices, male, mid-level, probably VPs. They were just around the corner by the elevator, laughing, talking too loud. I stopped walking. The HR rep didn't notice. She was busy checking something on her clipboard. So I stood still, not hiding, just not moving. And I listened. He was a loose end. Better to cut him before the audit window closes. You think anyone's gonna notice? Please. Half the execs signed off. Besides, it's not like Reyes kept backups. Old school guy. They laughed again. The elevator dinged. Footsteps faded. They didn't realize I was still standing there. They didn't realize I'd built the system that tracked approvals by signature timing. And they definitely didn't realize I was still wearing the company-issued security badge. Deactivated, yes. But the embedded mic hadn't been wiped. Just like the system, it remembered. I pressed the hidden record button in my coat sleeve, something we use to test voice log recognition in noisy environments. It was a habit I never fully broke. That habit just caught their voices. Clear, clean, and admissible. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel anything, really. Only confirmation. They hadn't just let me go. They'd timed it, planned it, tried to erase me before something could be found. But they didn't understand how the system worked. It wasn't about me catching them. It was about the system seeing what they tried to hide. I walked out of the building and stepped into the cold. It was late afternoon, but the sky was already dimming. I sat in my car for a long time. No music, no calls, just breathing. Sometimes silence is the loudest sound in the world. I opened my laptop and checked the backup logs. Clause 17B had already started its countdown. 90 days, ticking silently. Every transaction, every system flag, every unusual delay in expense approvals. They were being archived, compressed, and stored. And when the timer hit 0, the system wouldn't ask for permission. It would act, but I didn't want to wait passively. So I reached out to an old friend. No names, no details, just a message. They triggered the clause, "I'm watching." His reply came within minutes. A simple thumbs-up emoji. He used to run internal audit at another firm. We both knew the game. And we both knew. This wasn't about taking revenge. It was about finishing what the system was designed to do. Expose patterns, without fear, without interference. I drove home in the dark. No one called, no one emailed. For 17 years, my inbox had been full. Requests, alerts, reviews, clarifications. Now it was silent. But my system wasn't. It was working. Quietly. Steadily. Following a path I had laid out long ago. I wrote Clause 17B for worst-case fraud. I never thought they'd trigger it themselves. Clause 17B wasn't something I came up with overnight. It wasn't born out of suspicion. It came from watching systems fail, not because they were broken, but because people stopped looking. Over time, I realized that most companies don't collapse from external threats. They rot from the inside, quietly, one blind spot at a time. So I built a safeguard. Clause 17B wasn't listed in any employee handbook. It wasn't in the HR files or the official compliance memos. But it lived in the audit system's logic. A simple trigger. If the internal audit function was disabled, meaning if all admin accounts tied to independent review were cut, and if after 90 days, no authorized override was logged, then the system would initiate an autonomous report delivery to 3 external entities. The SEC, our outside compliance counsel, and a private storage node on a secure cloud server I registered under a blind trust. No alarms, no approvals, no delays. It wasn't about revenge. It was about continuity. I'd seen how things played out in other companies. When internal control was compromised, they'd start deleting logs, rewriting narratives, assigning blame to someone who had already been walked out the door. I didn't want that option to exist, so I designed Clause 17B to be invisible, until it wasn't. During audits, executives asked about trace integrity, data retention, and exception routing. I answered their questions truthfully. But no one ever asked what happened if we were removed. No one ever thought they'd be the ones trying to clean their own fingerprints off a shattered window. I buried the clause deep. Appendix D, Revision 11 of the Tracelock Technical Specification, page 94, one sentence. In the event of unauthorized termination of internal audit oversight, autonomous compliance trace protocol shall initiate per logic branch, R. 17B. Most engineers wouldn't know what that meant, and those who did had long since left the company. The irony, they triggered it themselves. When they deactivated my access and reassigned audit permissions to a junior IT liaison with no trace clearance, they unknowingly flipped the switch. Clause 17b didn't care why. It didn't check for human context. It only read the sequence audit authority removed. No override registered. Clock started. I checked the log the night I got home. There it was. Line item time-stamped within 2 minutes of my badge deactivation. Audit role revoked J. Reyes. Override status null. R17B trigger countdown initialized. ETA 90 days. I sat back in my chair, closed my eyes, let the silence stretch. It wasn't satisfaction, it wasn't relief. It was something quieter. Like hearing a door click shut behind you knowing you locked it long ago. The system was now autonomous. It would continue to ingest transaction data, cross-validate invoices, vendor records, approval chains, aggregate anomalies. And on day 90 it would generate a report. Encrypted, multi-format, time-stamped. Then it would deliver it using the exact pathways I set up years earlier during our SOX upgrade. They didn't know any of this. Why would they? To them, I was just another legacy employee, a holdover from a more cautious era. Too meticulous, too methodical, too slow. That's what one of them said during a board meeting years back. I'd seen the transcript. Julian's great for structure, but he doesn't scale with growth. They were right in a way. I didn't scale with chaos. I built systems that caught it. There's a kind of peace that comes with knowing something unstoppable has already begun. You don't have to raise your voice. You don't have to act. You just wait. The next morning I logged in through a private mirror portal. No breach, no warning. The system still recognized the shell account I'd built into our disaster recovery protocol. All read-only, no modification access, just enough to watch. I watched the pattern engine light up. Watched as the early anomalies began clustering. Outlier bonuses, irregular vendor IDs, timestamp gaps in approval sequences. I watched it all, and I remembered something someone told me once early in my career. The cleanest revenge is the one you never have to deliver yourself. They thought it was quiet, but the system was already awake. Day 3. That's when I saw the first sign. A delay in the monthly vendor reconciliation. Normally, it processed in batches by 10 a.m. sharp. That morning, the confirmation logs didn't close until 2:42 p.m. It looked like a tech hiccup if you didn't know what you were looking for. But the system didn't just track events. It tracked behavioral patterns. And something wasn't behaving the way it used to. I wasn't on the inside anymore, but I could still read between the lines. The system's anomaly engine picked it up. Vendor process delay, 3.8 HR deviation, signature mismatch, VP AP. That signature belonged to one of the newer VPs, the one I'd heard laughing near the elevator. And now his approvals were starting to skip, or stall, or pass through secondary proxies. It wasn't panic yet, but it was correction. Someone was trying to clean something too late. Day 7. Multiple logins from finance directors into archived audit modules. Not new data, not new reviews. Old reports, old trace routes, stuff that should have been long forgotten, unless you were trying to find out what was already watching you. The system flagged it quietly. I watched as it marked each unusual access with a passive tag. Review flag legacy access spike. Audit module C2. User D. Ferguson. Ferguson, the one who once told me you make things harder than they need to be, Julian. Now he was digging through the very structure he used to call obsolete. Day 10. An internal IT ticket was filed to investigate trace engine latency. That made me pause. Not because they'd found something, but because they hadn't. The system's speed hadn't changed. Its output hadn't slowed. The latency was a result of them trying to throttle access, probably to reduce the number of flags being generated. Which, of course, only generated more flags. That's how the engine was designed. I remembered building that part of the logic tree. It had a nested loop. Any attempt to suppress alerts would result in a metaflag, a signal that someone was trying to interfere. It wouldn't stop them, but it would remember. Day 13. The first round of quiet reassignments began. The system logs showed shifts in account authority. Several mid-tier compliance analysts had their access quietly revoked. One was reassigned to data hygiene review. Another was placed on indefinite leave. That's usually how it starts, not with firings, but with silence, with reshuffling. I imagined the meetings. Someone in a closed-door session sweating over a projected spreadsheet saying, "It's probably nothing but let's keep it contained, just in case." They still didn't know about Clause 17b. They didn't know a clock was ticking. But the discomfort had started. They could feel something in the air. That's the thing about systems. You don't always hear them. But when you try to mute them, the silence feels louder. Day 15. I ran a full mirror scan. No breach, no tampering. The system was intact. But the anomaly clusters were growing. Clusters mean correlation. It means what was once isolated is starting to form patterns. Like veins in marble. Or cracks in old paint. Vendor chains with shared P.O. boxes. Bonus authorizations signed by proxies minutes before payroll cutoff. Expense reports altered just outside review thresholds. None of it meant guilt yet, but it meant something deeper was being exposed. Not in a courtroom. Not by a whistleblower. By the system. And it wasn't asking for permission. That night I sat at my kitchen table. Same spot I used to review final reports during quarterly filings. Same creaking chair. Same soft glow of the desk lamp I never replaced. The house was quiet, but inside the server, a pulse was growing. Data doesn't lie. It doesn't get tired. It doesn't flinch when someone powerful tells it to look the other way. It just builds. I sipped my coffee and looked at the logs again. Line by line, redundant entries, missing initials, patterns repeating. The system didn't care who Julian Reyes was. It only cared that a condition had been met. And now, like gravity, it was moving toward resolution. They tried to control the story. But the system had already written its own. If you've ever been quietly erased from a place, you know the silence that follows isn't real. It's rehearsed. A performance. And I started seeing it everywhere. If you're still watching this and know what it feels like to be written out of your own work, hit subscribe. There are more of us than you think. Day 18. A press release went out. It was buried just a paragraph at the bottom of a Q2 operational update. Something about ongoing audit modernization and transitioning compliance leadership to align with strategic priorities. I knew what that meant. They were trying to preempt the fallout, to make it look like change was planned, not reactive. But the system didn't care about spin. It only logged what happened. And what happened was this: senior audit. Flag deletion of legacy audit records. Timestamp mismatch. Authorization level. Invalid. They were scrubbing. Too late and not cleanly. I checked the deletion log. They'd tried to remove 6 years' worth of approval chains tied to one executive. But the backups weren't stored in a single location. That was never how Tracelock worked. The data was fragmented across nodes with integrity hashes embedded at each step. Delete one copy and 3 others report the change. Try to alter it and the system reverts the snapshot to the last uncorrupted state. I didn't build Tracelock to be smart. I built it to be stubborn. Day 21. I received an email from someone I hadn't heard from in years. Andrea from legal. We used to sit 2 floors apart. Back then, she handled compliance policy and legal language for the board. Her message was short. "Julian, off the record, did you ever implement a trigger protocol tied to audit access?" I didn't respond right away. Because in that moment, I realized something. Someone inside had figured out Clause 17b existed. Maybe not all of it, but enough to know that something was running without permission. I waited a day before replying. Then I sent just one line. "If it's active, you won't stop it. You'll only confirm it." I never heard back. Day 24. A new executive memo was leaked. Not to the press. Internally. It warned about unexpected legacy system behaviors and advised leadership to avoid speculative conversations that may damage internal morale. They were circling the wagons. But morale wasn't their problem. It was the math. Because the anomaly engine was no longer surfacing just hints. It was clustering by department, grouping by approval thresholds, tagging repetitive vendor interactions with multi-entity flags. You can't unspin that. Not when it's tied to numbers. I watched as the system started generating pre-compilation reports. Early drafts, the kind we used to review before external audit cycles. Only this time no one had asked for them. No one had signed off. But there they were, building in the background. Each draft had a trace code. Each trace code tied to a person. each person tied to a signature chain. It was like watching puzzle pieces float into place without hands. I thought about what they might do next. They wouldn't admit it. Not yet. They'd try to contain the fallout, create noise, maybe bring in outside consultants to write glowing summaries, blame systems, blame the past. That's always the next play. Rewrite the story before the story writes them. But Tracelock wasn't listening to executives anymore. It was listening to evidence. And evidence doesn't care who's in the room. That night I drove past the building. It was late. Lights still on. I imagined them inside small war rooms, teams working overtime. No one really sure what they were looking for. Just trying to stay ahead of something they couldn't see. But it was already too late. Because the system didn't need them to see. It only needed time. It only took one unredacted name in a draft report to turn their caution into fear. Day 28. The system released its first auto-generated report. It wasn't meant for human eyes. Just a preliminary summary. A dry index document compiled from flagged anomalies. Standard protocol before full synthesis. But someone read it, and someone saw what they weren't supposed to. It wasn't the report that caused panic. It was the name, buried in line 234 of the draft's trace log. Approval chain vendor ID 0982, final authorization L. Delaney. That name was never meant to be there, not in plain text. The redaction protocol should have masked it. Initials only. First and last digits replaced with placeholder characters. But the flag logic had evolved. The anomaly engine had detected recursive access overrides. It interpreted them as high priority. So it bypassed redaction for audit clarity. No one had accounted for that edge case. L. Delaney was the CFO. Still in office, still attending board meetings, still smiling in quarterly reports. But that one entry tied to a vendor flagged for inconsistent billing and shared IP addresses broke the internal illusion. This wasn't abstract anymore. It had a face. I didn't smile, didn't celebrate. But I did watch. Because the moment Delaney's name surfaced, the logs shifted. Spike in access denial logs, attempts to suspend modules, back-channel logins from system admins flagged under old credentials. It was scrambling, a kind of digital flailing, but Tracelock wasn't built to fight. It was built to endure. Every override attempt was met with rollback. Every rollback triggered escalation. You don't plug a hole in a submarine by smashing the control panel. Day 29. A new patch was uploaded by internal IT. They labeled it Performance Optimization Update. But I could see what it was, an attempt to intercept report generation at the database layer. It didn't work. Tracelock operated on mirrored ledgers. Even if they paused the active node, the satellite nodes continued compiling. And once the node quorum was restored, the system resumed like nothing had happened. With one difference. It logged the interference. Data flow interruption attempt, flagged origin, internal patch ID 0429, retried sync, successful, tag escalated. The system wasn't just watching now, it was defending itself. I remembered something Delaney once told me in a hallway years ago. We had just completed a stress test on the legacy audit protocol. She smiled and said, "You overbuild Julian. No system needs to watch itself." She was wrong. Because people always try to rewrite what they fear. And if no one's watching the watchers, you're left with power, not truth. Day 30. A quiet memo circulated through upper management. It wasn't leaked this time. But the system flagged its language through an OCR scan. They'd used a shared printer, not realizing trace modules monitored metadata. The memo read, "Do not acknowledge legacy audit outputs externally. All inquiries are to be deferred to legal counsel. Absolutely no deletions are to be attempted without chain of custody sign-off." In other words, they knew something was coming, and they didn't know how to stop it. I checked the forecast reports, each one more precise than the last. By day 31, it would identify tiered risk zones by department. By day 37, it would simulate material exposure estimates. If left uninterrupted, the system would build a case strong enough to trigger external regulatory interest automatically. I didn't need to act. I just needed to not interfere. But that didn't mean I stopped watching. Late that night, a new entry appeared. Unauthorized access attempt. Endpoint XNet probe. Flagged IP offsite. User spoof J. Reyes. They were trying to frame a breach under my name. Clever, desperate, but not clean. My old credentials had been deactivated. They forgot that TraceLock tracked credential geometry, not just names. My typing pattern, my session intervals, my digital footprint. The spoof failed. Worse, it marked them. And now the system would begin tagging not just data, but intent. It wasn't just flagging departments anymore. It was flagging names and amounts. Day 33. The audit engine reached its third threshold. That meant one thing. TraceLock was no longer scanning operations for patterns. It was linking behaviors to beneficiaries. It stopped flagging transactions. It started identifying who gained from them. I'd only seen this happen once before. Years ago, during a simulation for an acquisition that never went through. We'd modeled a hostile internal play, just theory, just math. Back then, the results were academic. Risk bands, exposure charts, gray boxes with no names. But this wasn't theory anymore. The boxes weren't gray. They were labeled. The latest draft report, Auto 3B, listed 8 executive profiles, each one tied to a weighted gain index. Each gain traced to policy overrides, exception approvals, or duplicated contract line items. And at the top of that list was a board member. Her name was Celia Grant. I remembered her well. The kind of person who rarely spoke in meetings, but whose words bent the air when she did. She'd joined the board during a restructuring 5 years earlier, had a background in private equity, sharp, efficient, unreadable, and now her profile had a 94.2% correlation to flagged invoice loops across 6 shell vendors. Shells I didn't recognize. But the system had followed the trail through banking metadata, third-party ERP endpoints, and signature overlaps. It didn't accuse her. It simply reported, line after line, dates, amounts, transaction IDs. That was the moment it became personal. Because once the audit begins naming board members, it stops being an internal issue. It becomes a liability. Day 34. The escalation logs spiked. Legal teams initiated a credential freeze on multiple mid-level accounts. Not because they were guilty, but because those accounts had touched files tied to flagged data. They were trying to build walls after the house had already cracked. A small note appeared in the system feed. Internal role reassignment. User A. Carlisle. Note, pending external review. Andrea. She was the one who'd emailed me 2 weeks ago. The one who asked if Clause 17B was real. They were closing the circle now, tying off ends, isolating potential leaks. I stared at her name for a long time, not because I felt guilty, but because I knew what was coming for her. She wasn't corrupt, she was curious. And in places like that, curiosity is dangerous. That evening I received a call. No name, blocked number. I let it go to voicemail, then listened. A male voice, low, steady. You've made your point, Julian. But if you keep watching, it's going to come back to you. Systems fail. People don't forget. No threats, just implication. But I recognized the cadence. It was the general counsel, the same man who once praised TraceLock for its surgical precision. Now he was warning me not to let the blade keep cutting. I didn't respond, didn't need to, because the next day the system sent an alert to my mirror node. It had found something new. Not just fraud, not just access abuse. It found a conflict of interest loop. Celia Grant listed as advisor on a funding board that funneled capital into a vendor later used by the company, a vendor she personally approved contracts for. A closed circuit, and now fully visible. TraceLock did something I didn't expect. It generated a continuity fork, a secondary pathway to store a duplicate version of the audit report. Encrypted, time-locked, and marked for automatic external release if any node was compromised. It had reached fail-safe logic. Clause 17B was still counting down. But the system had crossed into autonomous defense. It would finish the report, whether I was watching or not, whether I was around or not. I sat in my chair that night watching the logs scroll, and for the first time in years I felt removed. Not powerless, just unnecessary. The system didn't need me anymore. And maybe that was the point. I built it to survive people. Now it was doing exactly that. It wasn't the report that triggered the collapse. It was an old form. One signature. Out of place. Day 36. The system was quiet. Too quiet. No new flags, no access violations, no redactions. That didn't mean they'd won. It meant they'd retreated. When executives stop trying to interfere, it's not because they've given up. It's because they're buying time. That morning, the logs showed something new. An unusual surge in encrypted outbound traffic. Destination IP offshore. Routing through 3 VPN hops. They were sending something out. Probably the early drafts of the report. Or a modified summary version for outside counsel. Trying to control the narrative before it became public. That was their mistake. Because the system didn't just monitor transactions. It remembered who touched what. And someone had touched something they shouldn't have. Day 37. I was reviewing one of the older approval chains. Not part of the active audit set, just cleaning up loose ends. Then I saw it. A scanned PDF, 6 years old, buried in the archive folder for vendor onboarding documents. The file name was generic, authform v0982v3.pdf. But when I opened it, I froze. At the bottom of the page, under Internal Liaison, was a signature. Neat, slanted, in blue ink barely visible on the scan. It was Celia Grant's signature. That didn't make sense. Board members don't sign onboarding documents, especially not for minor vendors. That's what legal or operations does, never the board. Unless they weren't board members yet. I checked the date. The form was signed 2 months before Celia officially joined the board, which meant 2 things. 1, she had influence over vendor selection before she held a formal role. 2, she lied on her conflict of interest disclosures. Because that vendor, V0982, was one of the key shells linked to her profile. I fed the document through Tracelock's historical index. The response came back instantly. Linked anomaly, unauthorized signature, pre-board involvement detected, cross-referenced with vendor chain C7. Then the system escalated. It didn't need confirmation. It recognized the pattern. Backdating, unauthorized approval, silent financial gain. The trigger point had been reached. Tracelock began compiling its final synthesis. This wasn't a summary. It wasn't a list of flags. It was a narrative report. Chronological, causal, designed for legal review. And at the top of the chain of events, primary exposure source Grant Celia, pre-board activity, conflict-linked vendor authorization. They could still deny it, still claim the system misread intent. But the signature was real. And the system didn't infer guilt. It mapped causality. It showed exactly how decisions flowed, where policies were bypassed, when financial gains occurred. It was no longer internal documentation. It was evidence. Day 38. The company scheduled an off-site strategy session, a leadership alignment summit according to the internal memo. I knew the location. They'd used the same retreat center back in 2017 during the last merger. A place with no active monitoring systems, no archived servers. They wanted a clean space, somewhere the system couldn't reach. But it was too late, because Tracelock had already compiled the final packet. And according to Clause 17b, it would trigger an external notification once quorum integrity was breached. And quorum was already breaking. By noon, 3 key systems stopped syncing. 2 finance managers submitted resignation letters. 1 mid-level compliance lead went on medical leave. None of them coordinated. But the system recognized the pattern. People were jumping ship, not because they knew everything, but because they knew enough to feel the ground shift. That evening I watched the final trace report build. Line by line, no embellishments, no interpretations. Just truth, cold, documented, undeniable. And near the bottom of the report, a small note auto-generated by the system. System behavior aligns with Clause 17b. External release protocol pending. 22 HRs to trigger. They'd fired me quietly. No warning, no explanation. But the system I left behind didn't scream. It didn't rage. It just waited. And then when no one thought it would matter, it remembered everything. They called in outsiders to stop the audit. But the failsafe had already left the building. Day 39. The memo hit their inboxes at 7:04 a.m. Subject line: Urgent external audit threat, immediate response required. It wasn't from compliance. It came from the CTO's office. Someone finally realized this wasn't a glitch or a disgruntled former employee meddling in the background. They were facing a systemic release, and they were late. I wasn't watching everything live anymore. Didn't have to. My mirror node sent hourly summaries. Encrypted packets, low priority unless flagged. That morning one came through with a high-risk tag. A change in access behavior. A surge of administrative logins from a range I didn't recognize. Outside consultants. They'd brought in a cybersecurity firm. I knew the name, big firm. Fortune 500 clients, specialized in breach response and disaster containment. The kind of people who get paid to rewrite timelines. But Tracelock didn't care about narrative, only integrity. The consultants tried a sandbox test. They cloned the audit engine into an isolated container, scrubbed it of triggers, removed all external nodes, hoped to reset the logic before the next quorum timestamp. They didn't know. The real failsafe wasn't in the system. It was outside. Clause 17b didn't just rely on internal behavior. It required redundancy. At deployment, I wrote a subroutine that created a dormant backup. It lived off-network, in a third-party platform used for quarterly regulatory filings. Encrypted, hidden behind benign file names. Only 2 triggers could wake it. Quorum failure across more than 2 primary nodes. A signature mismatch from the master credential file. Both had already occurred. Day 40. The firm recommended full system shutdown. Cold reboot, purge logs, rollback firmware. It was drastic, risky, but they were desperate. They wanted to stop the final export. Problem was the export wasn't internal anymore. Tracelock had already scheduled the release. It had already queued the digest packet to the backup node. Cutting the power wouldn't stop it. It would only validate the final condition. Loss of control. They paused the shutdown. For 90 minutes the system sat idle. No new queries, no login attempts. Then came the override. A full access key push bypassing internal policy. But Tracelock didn't just log that kind of event. It reflected it. The override triggered a diagnostic response. And the response message was brutal. External tampering detected. Authority invalid. Final release scheduled 23H04M remaining. At that point, the consultants stepped back. Not because they gave up, but because they realized they weren't dealing with a leak. They were dealing with a design. A machine built to survive betrayal. Not just from outsiders, but from within. Back in my apartment, I sat with the window cracked open. Seattle was quiet. You wouldn't know a company was unraveling just a few miles away. I thought about the people still inside. Some of them had no idea what was happening. Just answering emails, planning quarterly reviews, waiting for the next all-hands meeting. They didn't know the system had already drawn its map. That their leadership was standing on ground that was shifting inch by inch. By late afternoon, another alert came in. A name popped up I hadn't seen in years. Marcus Volin, former CTO, the man who approved Tracelock's deployment contract in the first place. I assumed he'd long moved on, but now his credential ID had reactivated. Used once, from an IP in DC. No login, just a ping. The system flagged it as dormant contact reawakening. I smiled. Someone else had kept a copy. Maybe Marcus had seen the signs. Maybe he knew back then that this company would try to eat its own tail. That they'd try to erase people like me once we became inconvenient. Maybe that's why he never asked for a backdoor. Just a clean system, with a single rule. If something breaks, don't trust the humans to fix it. Trust the record. As the day closed, I received the final pre-release summary. The audit was 97% complete. The attachments included linked approval chains, financial beneficiary index, conflict of interest timelines, access attempts post-termination, external trigger map, and one simple line at the end, awaiting final quorum expiration, 15H17M remaining. There was nothing left to do. No more buttons to press, no more code to write, no more calls to make. It was happening, whether they accepted it or not. The system didn't explode. It whispered, and then it was gone. Day 41. At 06:00 a.m. the quorum countdown reached 0. There was no sound, no alert, no screen flashing red. Just a line of code executing silently. The backup node unlocked itself. The digest packet already compiled was released to its designated endpoints. One went to an external regulatory platform. Another to a compliance contact inside the Department of Financial Oversight. The third was personal. I had written that rule for myself. If the system ever reached final release, send a copy to me. Not for ego, just for record keeping. Because if history is going to remember this, it should remember it clearly. The report was 318 pages long. Everything was there. The vendor fraud rings, the conflict of interest violations, the approval chain manipulations, even the buried signature from Celia Grant. But the most damning part wasn't the data. It was the timeline. Each decision, each cover-up, each moment someone looked away when they should have asked questions. It painted a picture, not of a single villain, but of a culture built on silence and comfort. And Tracelock had mapped it all. By 9:12 a.m. the first inquiry came in. Not to the board, not to the CTO, but to the general inbox of the legal department. A message from a junior analyst at the Oversight Commission. Polite, routine, requesting verification of certain documents tied to the company's vendor reporting records. They didn't know yet, but the ground had shifted beneath them. By 10:45 a.m., 3 more inquiries had come in. One from the SEC's regional office, 2 from external audit firms with indirect connections to the board. The tone changed. No longer routine. Now it was formal, citing subsection clauses, referencing dates, names, approval levels. The kind of language that doesn't ask questions. It prepares for subpoenas. Inside the company, things moved slower. People still came to work. Badges still scanned, coffee still brewed. But beneath the surface, systems began to degrade. One internal portal went offline. A finance dashboard wouldn't load. Someone tried to reboot the analytics engine. It refused authentication. Not broken, just locked out. Because Tracelock had done its final task. After release, it severed internal ties. It didn't belong to them anymore. By noon, the CTO was no longer listed on the employee directory. No announcement, no email blast. Just gone. A quiet deletion. Around the same time, Celia Grant's profile was removed from the board page on the investor site, replaced by a 404 error. The public didn't notice yet, but the market was listening, and silence reads like risk. That afternoon, I sat in my apartment with the report open on my screen. I didn't read every page. I didn't have to. I had already lived it. But I stopped at the last entry, a line the system had added automatically. Final compliance handoff complete. System integrity preserved. No fanfare, no signature. Just closure. The kind only code can give. I got a call later that day. This time not anonymous. It was from Andrea Carlisle. Her voice was quiet but steady. You were right. I didn't want to believe it, but the system never lied. I didn't respond for a moment. Then I asked, "Are you safe?" A pause. They moved me to a different floor. No access to systems, no meetings, just waiting. I nodded, though she couldn't see it. Keep everything I said, even the emails you think don't matter. I already did. That night a press release was issued. Buried. Short. Posted at 11:57 p.m. Due to recent findings, the company is undergoing a restructuring of its leadership team to better align with its values and compliance goals. No names, no details. But I didn't need them, because by then I had seen the list. The one Tracelock generated in its final moments. 8 names, each tied to financial anomalies, each connected by one thing, their silence. The story wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to the agencies, to the auditors, to the market. But the truth, that was mine. And the truth had already moved on. You don't always need a voice when the system you built tells the truth louder than you ever could. It's been 6 weeks. No lawsuits, no apologies, no headlines with my name in them. Just the slow unraveling of a company that thought silence could protect them. I still live in the same apartment, same coffee mug, same broken window latch I never got around to fixing. The world didn't change. I did. Not all at once, but slowly. Like old skin shedding in pieces you don't notice until they're gone. There were moments I wanted to explain it all. To someone. Anyone. The long nights, the invisible labor, the things I fixed that no one even knew were broken. But I never sent an email, never posted online. What would I say? They fired me. I stayed quiet, but the system didn't. The funny thing is, Tracelock never had a dramatic mission. It wasn't built to take anyone down. I made it to protect, to give structure to a place that was starting to rot from the inside. I thought maybe if I could show people what was wrong, they'd fix it. Instead, they tried to erase the messenger. They forgot the message lives somewhere deeper. I don't know what will happen next. The agencies will do what they do. Maybe there will be fines. Maybe a forced acquisition. Maybe some of them will quietly disappear behind legal settlements. But I won't be part of any of it. I don't want revenge in the form of attention. I don't need to win on paper. They made me invisible. I just let them believe I'd stay that way. A few days ago, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address, no note. Just a flash drive. I scanned it first, of course. Then I opened it. Inside a copy of the final audit report, watermarked. Transferred from offsite vault. Received anonymous. It wasn't mine. Not this version. Someone else had archived it, preserved it. Which meant somewhere out there, someone else believed in what I built. I sat with it open for hours. Not reading. Just watching the screen. Page by page, each section confirmed what I already knew. Not just the fraud. Not just the negligence. But the fear. The fear of being found out. The fear of losing control. It was all there mapped in decisions, dates, emails, signatures. The truth didn't need volume. Just permanence. Andrea called me once more. Her voice sounded different. Tired. Clear. They're trying to rebuild around the mess. Most of the leadership's gone. But the culture's still shaky. I asked if she was staying. She didn't answer right away. I'm not sure she said. But I wanted to tell you. Someone in the agency asked me if they could contact the original system architect. I waited. I didn't give them your name, but I think they'll find you anyway. I didn't feel panic or pride, just stillness. I don't know if I'll ever work in systems again. I don't know if I want to. But I do know this. There's power in making something that outlives your job title. Something that still speaks even when you've been silenced. That's not revenge. It's design. Sometimes I think about what they would have done differently if they'd known. If they had realized how Tracelock worked. If they had paid attention to the way I worked. But then I remember. They didn't fire me because I failed. They fired me because I noticed things they wanted ignored. And that more than anything else is what brought them down. I'm not looking for closure. I built it. Line by line. Trigger by trigger. It's sitting on servers I no longer control, being read by people I'll never meet in rooms I'll never step foot in. And that's enough. If you've ever been pushed out, overlooked, or quietly erased, know this. You don't always need to fight loud. Sometimes the system you leave behind does the talking for you. And when it does, it speaks in truth no one can shut down. If this story meant something to you, consider subscribing. We tell real stories about quiet revenge, earned redemption, and people who refuse to disappear. Thank you for listening.